The transport shook so hard that my teeth cracked together, and the first thing I heard was screaming that did not sound human at all. I was Daniel Hart, and 3 hours earlier I had been fixing a broken coolant line on a cargo hauler that was never supposed to touch a royal convoy. Now I was flat on the floor of a stranger's vehicle, my ears ringing, smoke pouring through a hole in the ceiling, and a creature with silver eyes and shaking hands was screaming words I could not understand. The convoy had been moving through a narrow canyon pass when the attack hit. I had only been given a ride because my hauler broke down near their route, and their laws demanded they not leave a stranded traveler behind, even a human one. That single act of alien courtesy was about to change my entire life. Outside, something exploded again, and the vehicle tilted hard to one side. I grabbed the edge of a seat to keep from sliding into a shattered window. Through the gap I saw armored figures moving fast across the canyon rocks, firing weapons that cracked the air like thunder. They were not here to rob anyone. They were here to kill. The creature next to me was young, small, dressed in fine layered cloth that was now torn and smoking at one sleeve. She could not have been more than a teenager by human standards. Her guards were already down, either outside or unconscious on the floor near the front of the vehicle. She looked at me with wide silver eyes, and for the first time I understood that she was terrified in a way that had nothing to do with alien customs. Fear looks the same on every species when it is real. I did not know her name yet. I did not know she was the princess of the Threll Empire, heir to a throne older than human civilization. All I knew was that she was a scared kid, and the people outside wanted her dead. Another blast rocked the transport, and the side door tore open completely. A tall, armored figure stepped through, carrying a weapon that hummed with blue light. Its faceplate was smooth, expressionless, built for war and nothing else. It raised the weapon toward the princess. I did not think. There was no time to think. I grabbed a metal toolkit case from the floor, the only heavy object within reach, and threw myself between them. The weapon fired as I moved, and the shot clipped my shoulder instead of her chest. Pain exploded through my arm, hot and sharp, but I stayed on my feet. Whatever that weapon was built to do to a Threll body, it clearly was not built with human anatomy in mind, because I was still standing when I should not have been. The armored attacker paused, just for a second, as if my body refusing to fall did not make sense to it. That second was enough. I swung the toolkit case with everything I had left and caught the attacker across the side of the helmet. It staggered back through the broken door, and I followed, driven by something older than thought, some deep animal instinct that told me if I stopped now, we both died. My shoulder screamed with every movement, but somewhere in the back of my mind a calmer voice was still working. The part of me trained by years of hard labor on freight ships where a single mistake could kill an entire crew. That voice told me to keep moving, to use the wreckage, to never stand still long enough to become an easy target. I did not feel brave. I felt like a man running on nothing but momentum and refusal to quit. Outside the transport, the fighting was chaos. 3 more armored figures were converging on the wreck, moving with practiced coordination, calling to each other in short, clipped bursts of sound. The convoy guards who were still alive were pinned down behind a burning vehicle, unable to reach the princess in time. I grabbed a fallen guard's weapon from the ground, a strange device shaped nothing like anything from home, and pointed it at the nearest attacker on pure instinct. I pulled what looked like a trigger. It worked. The attacker went down. My shoulder was burning, my vision kept blurring at the edges, and every part of my training screamed that I should be finding cover, not standing in the open. But the princess was still inside that transport, and nobody else was close enough to protect her. The second attacker turned toward me, weapon rising. I dropped low, felt a shot pass close enough to burn the air near my ear, and closed the distance before it could fire again. There was a scramble, brief and brutal, neither of us fighting clean, both of us fighting to survive. I do not remember every detail of it. I remember it ending with the attacker down and my hands shaking. The third came from my blind side, and I only turned in time because the princess screamed a warning from the wrecked transport, a sound I did not understand but recognized instantly as danger. I twisted away from the strike, felt it graze my ribs instead of finding its mark, and answered with everything my body had left. When it was finally still, I stood in the middle of the canyon pass, breathing hard, blood running down my arm, surrounded by wreckage and silence. The gunfire had stopped. The smoke was clearing, and the princess was climbing out of the transport on shaking legs, staring at me like she had never seen anything like me before. That was when the royal guard finally arrived, engines roaring overhead, too late to stop the attack, but just in time to see its aftermath. Armored soldiers dropped from hovering craft and surrounded us in seconds, weapons raised, voices sharp with alarm. Then they saw their princess standing, alive, unharmed, and they saw me, a bleeding stranger from another world entirely, standing between her and 4 fallen attackers. Nobody moved for a long moment. The guards looked at their princess. They looked at me. They looked at the wreckage of the ambush that should have killed her. One guard knelt beside a fallen attacker and pulled back the cracked faceplate, and I watched his expression shift from alarm to something closer to dread. Whoever these attackers were, they were not simple bandits. Their armor was too clean, their weapons too precise, their coordination too practiced. This had been planned, and planned well, by someone who expected it to succeed. The princess stepped forward before any of them could act, and to the visible shock of every guard around us, she placed herself directly in front of me, as if she were the one protecting me now instead of the other way around. She said something in her language, urgent and fast, and though I could not understand the words, I understood the tone. She was telling them not to hurt me. One of the guards lowered his weapon slowly, studying me with an expression I could not read. Then he spoke into a communicator on his wrist, and though I did not know it yet, the words he said would reach the highest levels of the Threll Empire within minutes. A human had stopped an assassination attempt against the crown princess. Alone, wounded, outnumbered, and still standing. I did not feel like a hero in that moment. I felt like a man who was bleeding badly, standing on an alien world, surrounded by soldiers who did not know what to make of me. My legs finally gave out, and the last thing I saw before the world went dark was the princess kneeling beside me, her silver eyes wide with something that looked almost like wonder, saying words I still could not understand, but somehow knew meant thank you. When I woke up, I was no longer on that canyon road. I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with soft light and quiet air and the distant hum of machines I did not recognize. And somewhere far above me, in a throne room built from centuries of power and tradition, a queen who ruled an empire of trillions was already asking to see the human who had saved her daughter's life. I did not know it yet, but the moment I threw myself between that princess and a weapon meant to kill her, I had stopped being a stranded traveler and started being something the Threll Empire had never encountered before. A variable they could not predict, a man they could not control, and a problem the queen intended to solve in the only way she knew how, by keeping me. I woke up strapped to a table that was too smooth and too cold to be anything from home, with 3 sets of alien eyes staring down at me like I was a puzzle they were trying to solve. My shoulder had been treated, wrapped in something that pulsed faintly with warmth, and the pain had faded to a dull ache. But the fear that gripped me the moment I opened my eyes had nothing to do with pain. I did not know where I was, and I did not know what these people intended to do with me. One of them, an older Threll with pale markings across her face, spoke a few words into a device on her wrist. A moment later, a soft mechanical voice translated for me, slightly delayed and slightly flat, but understandable. "You are safe," it said. "You are in the medical wing of the Sky Palace. The princess requested your care personally." That was the first time I heard the word princess used to describe the girl I had protected. It hit me harder than the pain in my shoulder had. I had thrown myself in front of an assassin's weapon for a member of an alien royal family, without knowing a single thing about who she was or what that meant for me now. I was given something to drink that tasted like nothing I had ever had before, and within an hour I was steady enough to sit up and look around properly. The room was enormous, built from pale stone and curved glass, with light pouring in from a sky the color of pale gold. I had never seen anything like it, not in any corner of human space I had ever traveled through. A guard entered without knocking, tall and armored, the same kind of soldier who had surrounded us on the canyon road. He studied me for a long moment before speaking through his own translator device. "The Queen has requested your presence," he said. "Now." I did not feel like I had much choice in the matter, so I stood, ignoring the ache in my shoulder, and followed him out of the room and down a long corridor lined with towering windows. Through them I could see the true scale of the place I had woken up in, a palace built into the side of a mountain, overlooking a city so vast it seemed to stretch to the horizon in every direction. Millions of lights, millions of lives, all of it ruled from wherever I was being taken. The throne room, when we finally reached it, was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The ceiling rose so high that it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with carved images that told the history of an empire far older than my own species had existed. At the far end, on a raised platform bathed in golden light, sat the queen. She did not look like the guards or the princess. She was larger, her presence heavier, her eyes darker, almost black, and when she looked at me, I felt something press against my mind that was not quite a sound and not quite a thought, but somewhere in between. I would later learn that the Threll ruling family carried a psychic bond with their people, a connection woven into the hive itself, and that the queen rarely bothered restraining the full weight of her presence for visitors. She was not restraining it for me. Beside her throne stood the princess, and the moment our eyes met, something in her posture relaxed slightly, as if my arrival confirmed I was truly alive and truly well. She looked younger somehow, standing in that enormous room, dwarfed by the weight of her own family's power. The queen studied me for a long time before speaking. Her voice, translated a moment later by a device near the throne, was low and deliberate, each word placed with obvious control. "You are the human who stopped the attack on my daughter," she said. It was not a question. I straightened as best I could and answered honestly, because I did not know any other way to handle a moment like that. "I did what anyone would have done," I said. "She needed help. I was there." A ripple moved through the nobles gathered along the sides of the room, quiet murmurs in a language I still could not understand, though the tone was unmistakable. Disbelief, skepticism, in some cases, something close to insult, as if the idea that a human could simply choose to act with courage was somehow offensive to their understanding of how the universe worked. The queen raised a hand, and the room fell silent instantly, the kind of silence that comes only from absolute authority. "4 trained soldiers," she said, "armed, coordinated, prepared for this exact ambush, and you, alone, wounded, unarmed at the start, defeated them and protected my daughter until my guards arrived. Tell me how." I thought about lying, about making myself sound more capable than I actually was, but something about the weight of her gaze told me that would be a mistake. I told her the truth instead. "I did not plan any of it," I said. "I reacted. Humans are built that way. When something we care about is threatened, our bodies do things our minds have not agreed to yet. I was not thinking about strategy. I was thinking about keeping her alive." The queen was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way a scientist studies a sample under glass. Then she turned to the princess, and something passed between them that I could not read, a private exchange carried through whatever bond connected them. "You will remain here," the queen said finally, turning back to me, "as a guest of the crown, under my protection, for as long as necessary." Something in the phrasing bothered me immediately. As long as necessary did not sound like a temporary arrangement. It sounded like the beginning of something much longer. "I appreciate the hospitality," I said carefully, "but I have a ship and a life outside this palace. I would like to arrange my return home once I am able to travel." The queen's dark eyes did not waver. "That will not be possible at this time," she said. The room seemed to grow colder, though nothing about the temperature had changed. I felt the princess's gaze on me, worried, though she said nothing in front of the court. I looked back at the queen, choosing my next words with more care than I had ever used in my life. "With respect, Your Majesty," I said, "I am not one of your people. I do not answer to your throne. I helped your daughter because it was the right thing to do, not because I wished to become a permanent guest in your palace." A few of the nobles shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to hearing anyone speak to the queen that way. But she did not react with anger. Instead, something almost like curiosity flickered across her expression, as if my defiance only confirmed something she already suspected about my kind. "You misunderstand," she said. "This is not a punishment. It is protection. Whoever ordered that attack on my daughter knows your face now. They know what you did. If you leave this palace and return to open space, you will be a target for the rest of your life, hunted by people who have far greater resources than a single human freighter pilot." That answer landed harder than I expected. I had been so focused on the idea of being trapped that I had not considered the possibility that leaving might actually be more dangerous than staying. Still, something told me there was more to her decision than simple protection. The way she looked at me, the way the room had reacted to my survival, the way the princess would not quite meet my eyes when the subject of my staying came up, all of it suggested the queen had reasons she was not fully sharing. "For now," she said, rising from her throne with an air of finality that ended the conversation, "you will be given quarters befitting the man who saved a princess of the empire. You will be treated with honor, and you will not leave the palace grounds without an escort." The guards moved to lead me out, and I went, because there was nothing else to do in that moment, surrounded by soldiers in a palace I did not understand, on a world I had never chosen to visit. But as I walked out of that throne room, I glanced back once, and caught the princess watching me with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite gratitude, but something caught painfully between the two. That night, alone in quarters far too grand for a stranded cargo pilot, I stood at a window overlooking the Golden City and tried to make sense of everything that had happened in the span of a single day. I had gone from fixing a coolant line to becoming a permanent fixture in an alien royal court, all because I had refused to let a scared kid die in front of me. I did not know yet that the Queen's decision to keep me close had little to do with protection alone. I did not know that somewhere in the ancient records of the Threll Empire, there existed old warnings about a species called human, warnings written long before I was ever born, describing a kind of unpredictable strength that no hive mind could fully calculate or control. All I knew, standing at that window, with the weight of an entire alien empire suddenly wrapped around my life, was that going home was no longer going to be simple, and somewhere deep down, a part of me wondered if it would ever be possible at all. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it was shallow and restless, filled with the sound of weapons firing and the sight of the princess's frightened face. I woke before the palace's artificial dawn had even begun, my shoulder aching faintly, and found myself standing again at the window, watching the city lights fade slowly into morning gold. A soft knock came at my door not long after, and when I opened it, I found a young Threll attendant holding a tray of food I did not recognize, her posture stiff with formality. She bowed slightly, set the tray down without a word, and left before I could even offer thanks. It was a small moment, but it told me something important about the world I had woken up in. Every gesture here carried weight. Every action was shaped by rules I did not yet understand, rules I would need to learn quickly if I wanted any control over what happened to me next. I spent that first full day exploring the boundaries of my new confinement, testing how far the guards would allow me to wander, learning the layout of the gardens and corridors that would become my world for however long the Queen intended to keep me here. Everywhere I went, eyes followed me, curious and wary in equal measure, as if the entire palace was still trying to decide what exactly I was. 3 weeks passed before I understood how deep the trouble I had walked into truly ran, and it started with a conversation I was never meant to overhear. I had settled, as much as a man could settle in a palace built for a species that was not his own, into a strange kind of routine. Guards escorted me through gardens filled with plants that glowed faintly at night. Scientists studied samples of my blood with careful curiosity, asking questions about human biology that made it clear they had never encountered anything quite like it. And every few days, the princess, whose name I finally learned was Illyra, found an excuse to visit me, usually with some new dish from the palace kitchens or a question about human customs that had clearly been building in her mind for days. She was easier to be around than the rest of the court. There was no calculation in her, none of the careful political distance the nobles kept whenever they spoke to me. She was simply curious and grateful and slowly becoming something close to a friend in a place where I had none. It was during one of her visits that I first heard the term the Hive Elders used to describe humanity, spoken quietly by a pair of advisors passing through the garden nearby, unaware that I understood more of their language now than they realized. The translator device the Queen had given me had been quietly learning alongside me, and though my grasp of Threll's speech was far from perfect, I caught enough of what they said to feel a chill move through me. "The Unbound," one of them said. The word carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from centuries of fear passed down through generations. I asked Illyra about it later, once the advisors had gone, keeping my tone as casual as I could manage. "What does that mean?" I asked. "The Unbound." She hesitated, and for a long moment I thought she might refuse to answer. Then she sat down across from me, folding her hands carefully in her lap, and spoke in a quieter voice than I had heard from her before. "Long before I was born," she said, "before my mother's mother ruled, there were reports from the edges of Threll space, encounters with a species that did not think the way any other species thought, a species with no hive bond, no shared mind, each individual acting entirely on its own will. Our historians called them dangerous because they could not be predicted the way every other species could be predicted. They called them the Unbound." I felt my stomach tighten. "Are you saying that was us?" I asked. "Humans." Illyra nodded slowly. "The old records were fragmented," she admitted. "Sightings, mostly. A handful of encounters, none of them close, none of them violent. But the reports were enough to worry the elders of that time. A species capable of acting entirely outside the collective, driven by instincts no hive mind could calculate. My mother has read every one of those old records more times than anyone else in the Empire. Suddenly the pieces of the past few weeks began fitting together in a way I did not like. The Queen's insistence that I remain in the palace. The scientists studying my blood with such intensity. The careful way the guards watched me even during simple walks through the gardens, as if waiting for some unpredictable outburst that never came. "She is not just protecting me, am I right?" I said quietly. "She is studying me. Because of those old records." Illyra did not deny it. "My mother believes humanity may be exactly what those old warnings described," she said. "Not a threat, not exactly, but something the Empire has never truly understood. And after what you did on that canyon road, alone, wounded, without hesitation, she believes she finally has a chance to understand it." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the walls of the palace close in around me in a way they had not before. I had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that the Queen's decision to keep me close was simply about optics, about controlling a political situation involving her daughter's rescue. But this was something else entirely. I was not just a guest. I was a subject of study, a living piece of evidence in a debate about my entire species that had apparently been running for generations. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to everything around me, and the pattern only grew clearer. The scientists' questions were not idle curiosity. They were building a profile, cataloging my reflexes, my emotional responses, my capacity for what they called independent decision-making, a phrase that seemed to fascinate and unsettle them in equal measure. Every conversation with a noble carried an undertone of careful evaluation, as if they were all quietly trying to determine whether I represented an opportunity or a danger to the Empire's future. I confronted Illyra about it one evening, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice any longer. "I did not come here to be studied like an animal in a cage," I told her. "I came here because you needed help. I do not belong to your empire, and I never agreed to become a research subject for your mother's historians." Illyra flinched at my tone, but she did not look away. "I know," she said quietly, and I have told her the same thing more than once. But you must understand what you represent to her. The Empire has enemies on every border, powers that have grown bold in recent years, testing the edges of Threll territory more aggressively than they have in generations. My mother believes the old warnings about your species may hold the key to a strength the Empire desperately needs. She is not cruel, Daniel. She is afraid, and fear makes rulers do things that look like control. I wanted to be angry at that explanation, and part of me still was. But another part of me, the part that had spent years navigating dangerous cargo routes through lawless corners of human space, understood fear as a motivator better than most people did. Fear made people do desperate things. It did not excuse what the Queen was doing, but it explained it. That night, as I stood once again at the window of my quarters looking out over the Golden City, I noticed something I had missed before. Along the distant horizon, faint lights moved in slow, deliberate patterns, far too organized to be anything natural. Military vessels, I realized, more of them than I had seen since arriving. The palace guards had grown more numerous over the past few days as well, their patrols tighter, their expressions more tense. Something was coming. I could feel it in the same way I had felt the ambush coming on that canyon road, a pressure in the air that no translator device could ever properly explain. The next morning, an alarm I had never heard before rang through the palace, low and urgent, and every guard in the building moved at once, weapons raised, voices sharp with orders I could not fully understand. Illyra found me in the corridor outside my quarters, her face pale, her earlier calm entirely gone. "They have found us," she said, breathless. "The same enemy who sent the assassins after me. They are massing at the outer colonies. My mother believes this is only the beginning." I felt the weight of everything I had learned over the past 3 weeks settle into place at once. The old warnings about the Unbound, the Queen's obsession with understanding what made humans different, the scientists studying my blood as if searching for a weapon they did not yet know how to build. None of it had been about curiosity alone. The Queen had been preparing for exactly this moment, and somewhere in her calculations, I had become a piece she was not willing to lose. I thought back to every conversation I'd had with the scientists over the past 3 weeks. Every question about my reflexes, my tolerance for pain, my ability to make split-second decisions without consulting anyone else. At the time I had assumed it was simple curiosity about an unfamiliar species. Now I understood it had been something closer to an assessment, a careful measurement of whether the old warnings about the Unbound held any truth worth acting on. I also thought about Illyra and the quiet loyalty she had shown me since the moment I woke up in that medical wing. Whatever her mother's motives, Illyra's gratitude had never felt calculated. She had visited me not because she was ordered to, but because some part of her genuinely wanted to understand the strange visitor who had thrown himself between her and death without a single moment of hesitation. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. The corridors grew busier as the day wore on, filled with officers moving with sharp, urgent purpose, their earlier caution toward me replaced entirely by the singular focus of soldiers preparing for a fight they had feared for years. I stood in the middle of that controlled chaos, a stranger from another world entirely, and realized that whatever happened next, I was no longer simply a guest caught in the middle of an alien conflict. I had become part of it, whether I had chosen that role or not. The War Council convened within the hour, and to my surprise, I was summoned to attend it, standing at the edge of a circular chamber filled with generals, advisors, and the Queen herself, all gathered around a glowing map that displayed the outer edges of Threll territory in sharp detail. The enemy had a name now, spoken with clear contempt by every officer in the room. The Vrask, a splinter faction that had broken away from a rival hive generations ago, had spent decades rebuilding their strength in the shadows beyond Threll space, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. The attack on Illyra had not been an isolated act of aggression. It had been the opening move of a much larger campaign, a test to see how the Empire would respond before committing to full invasion. That test had failed for them, thanks to me. And now, humiliated and exposed, the The Vrask had decided to accelerate their plans rather than retreat. Their forces are already moving toward the outer colonies, one general reported, his voice tight with controlled urgency. 3 settlements have gone dark in the past 6 hours. Communications, defenses, all silent. We believe they are being taken, not destroyed. Taken. The word hung in the room with a weight that made even the most composed advisors shift uncomfortably. The Queen studied the glowing map for a long moment before speaking. "Send everything we have to the outer defense line," she said. "I want every available fleet in position within the day." "Your Majesty," another advisor said carefully, "our fleet strength has not fully recovered from the border conflicts 3 seasons ago. If the Vrask commit their full force to this campaign, we may not hold the line." The room fell silent at that admission, and I felt the tension in the air grow sharper, more desperate. I understood then, more clearly than I had understood anything since arriving in this palace, exactly why the Queen had been so unwilling to let me go. She was not simply protecting me. She was protecting a possibility, a chance that whatever made humans different, whatever ancient instinct had let me stand against 4 trained soldiers alone, might be the very thing her empire needed to survive. I stepped forward before I could stop myself, drawing every eye in the room toward me. "I can help," I said. The silence that followed was different from the others, heavier, filled with disbelief rather than fear. One general actually laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You are one man," he said. "This is a war, not a canyon ambush." "I understand that," I said, holding his gaze steadily, "but you are fighting this war the way you have always fought wars, with coordinated fleets and predictable formations. The Vrask know your tactics. They have studied your empire for generations, planning this exact moment. What they have not studied, what they cannot predict, is how a human thinks." The Queen watched me carefully, her dark eyes unreadable. "Explain," she said simply. I stepped closer to the glowing map, studying the positions of the outer colonies, the projected paths of the Vrask fleet, the gaps in the Threll defense line that even I, with only a few weeks of exposure to their military structure, could see clearly. "Your fleets move as one mind," I said, "because that is how your species operates. Every ship anticipates the others perfectly, because you share a connection I cannot begin to understand. That makes you strong, but it also makes you predictable to an enemy who has spent years studying exactly how that connection behaves. Humans do not share that connection. We improvise. We take risks your commanders would never authorize, because we are not bound by the same instincts. If I can help your officers think even slightly outside the patterns the Vrask expect, we create uncertainty. And uncertainty is the only thing an enemy this prepared has not planned for." The general who had laughed earlier no longer looked amused. The Queen studied the map for a long moment, then turned to me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something that looked almost like respect. "You would fight for an empire that has held you against your will," she said quietly. "I would fight for Elira," I answered honestly, "and for the people in those outer colonies who did not choose this war any more than I chose to be here. Whatever your reasons for keeping me, that does not change what is right." Something shifted in the Queen's expression at that answer, though she said nothing further about it in front of the council. Instead, she turned back to her generals and gave the order that would change everything. "Give him a position within the defense command," she said. "Let him advise. If his instincts serve my daughter as well as they did on that canyon road, they may yet serve this empire." The following days were a blur of preparation, strategy sessions, and long nights spent studying Threll military doctrine with an intensity I had never applied to anything in my life. I worked alongside officers who had spent decades in service, men and women who resented my presence at first, but slowly, grudgingly, began listening as the improvised tactics I suggested started producing results in simulated engagements. I pushed for smaller, faster strike teams instead of massed formations. I suggested false retreats designed to lure Vrask forces into overextending, a tactic that felt almost insulting in its simplicity to commanders trained in centuries of formal doctrine. but one that exploited exactly the kind of predictability I had warned the Queen about. Alira visited the command center often during those days, watching the preparations with a mixture of pride and worry that she made no effort to hide. "You do not have to do this," she told me one night, finding me alone after a long strategy session had finally ended. "Nobody would think less of you for staying within the palace walls where it is safe." "I would think less of myself," I told her. "And besides, someone has to make sure your mother's generals stop trying to fight this war exactly the way the enemy expects them to." She almost smiled at that, though the worry never fully left her eyes. The battle, when it finally came, unfolded across the outer colonies in a chaos that no simulation could have fully prepared any of us for. Vrask ships descended on the defense line in overwhelming numbers, exactly as the reports had warned, and for the first hours it seemed as though even the improvised tactics I had helped design would not be enough to hold them back. I stood in the command center beside the Queen herself, watching the battle unfold across a dozen glowing displays, calling out suggestions as the situation shifted minute by minute. When a Vrask flanking maneuver threatened to collapse our western defense, I pushed for an unconventional counter, splitting our remaining reserve fleet into smaller units that struck from unexpected angles rather than reinforcing the line directly. The Threll commanders hesitated, uncertain, trained their entire lives to trust coordination over improvisation. But the Queen, watching me with an intensity that had not wavered since the council meeting, gave the order herself. "Do as he suggests," she said. The gamble worked. The scattered strike teams caught the Vrask flanking force in a crossfire they had not anticipated, buying precious time for the main defense line to regroup. It was not the deciding moment of the battle, but it was the moment that proved the strategy could work, and from that point forward, the Threll commanders began listening more closely, adapting faster, fighting with a flexibility their doctrine had never demanded of them before. The battle raged for nearly 2 full days before the Vrask fleet, having lost far more than their commanders had planned for, finally broke formation and retreated beyond the border. Their invasion stopped before it could reach the heart of Threll territory. When the final reports came in, confirming the retreat, the command center erupted into something I had not seen from these people before, a release of tension so profound it looked almost like relief mixed with disbelief. Officers who had resented my presence just days earlier now looked at me with something closer to respect, though none of them said so directly. The Queen approached me slowly as the celebrations began around us, her expression unreadable in the way it always was, though something in her posture had changed, some weight lifted that had not been there before. "You saved my empire," she said quietly, just for the two of us to hear, "as you saved my daughter." "I did not do it for the empire," I told her honestly. "I did it because good people were about to lose everything, and I could not stand by and let that happen. That is simply who I am." The Queen studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had arrived in her palace, I saw something in her eyes that looked less like calculation and more like understanding. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "that is exactly what my ancestors failed to understand about your kind all those years ago." In the days that followed, reports continued arriving from the outer colonies, detailing the true cost of the battle. Homes destroyed, families displaced, soldiers who would never return to the families waiting for them. It was not a clean victory, and I made sure the celebrations happening within the palace walls did not let anyone forget that. War, even a war won, still left behind grief that no amount of relief could erase. I spent several of those days traveling with a small relief convoy to one of the hardest-hit settlements, helping coordinate the distribution of supplies alongside Threll engineers who had, only weeks earlier, viewed me with open suspicion. Something had changed in the way they worked beside me now, a willingness to listen that had not existed before the battle, and slowly, carefully, something that almost resembled trust. The settlement itself was a quiet, sobering place, filled with survivors picking through the wreckage of homes that had stood for generations before the Vrask attack tore through them. Children clung to their parents, watching the arriving convoy with the same wary curiosity I had once received myself, though this time there was no fear in their eyes, only a tired kind of hope. I helped where I could, moving supplies, repairing damaged shelters with tools that were unfamiliar but not impossible to understand, and by the time the convoy returned to the capital, something had settled in me that I had not expected to find on an alien world so far from everything I had once called home. A sense of purpose, not because anyone had commanded it of me, but because I had chosen it freely, again and again, in every decision that had brought me to this point. The days after the battle passed differently than the weeks before it had. Where once the guards had watched me with suspicion, now they nodded when I passed, some even attempting clumsy human greetings they had clearly practiced in advance. The scientists who had once studied my blood like a mystery to be solved now approached me with genuine questions, curious rather than clinical, eager to understand rather than simply catalog. Something in the palace had shifted, and I could feel it in every conversation, every glance, every small gesture of respect that had not existed before the outer colonies were saved. But none of that mattered as much to me as the conversation I knew was still coming, the one conversation the Queen had avoided since the battle ended. I found her alone one evening on a balcony overlooking the Golden City, standing in the same quiet stillness I had come to recognize as her way of processing the weight of her responsibilities. She did not turn when I approached, though I knew she was aware of my presence long before I spoke. "We need to talk about what happens now," I said. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "What do you wish to happen?" she asked. I considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I want to go home," I said, "not because I regret anything that happened here. Not because I am ungrateful for the care I have been given, or because I do not care about what happens to this empire, or to Alira, or even to you, but because I never chose this life. I was pulled into it by circumstance, and while I do not regret the choices I made once I was here, I never agreed to give up my own life in exchange for staying." The Queen turned to face me then, her dark eyes carrying an expression I had never seen from her before, something almost close to vulnerability. "I have ruled this empire for longer than your entire species has existed in the form you know it today," she said quietly. "I have made decisions that cost lives, decisions that saved lives, decisions I still do not know were right or wrong even now. When I first learned what you had done for my daughter, I told myself I was protecting you. Later, I told myself I was protecting my empire. Both were true, but neither was the whole truth." She paused, looking out over the city for a long moment before continuing. "The truth is," she said, "I was afraid. Afraid of what your kind represented, afraid of losing the only advantage I believed I had found against an enemy I knew was coming. I told myself that keeping you close was wisdom. It was fear wearing the mask of wisdom, and I understand now that the two are not the same thing." I did not say anything, letting her finish, sensing that this was a confession she needed to make in her own time. "You did not fight for me because I commanded it," she continued. "You fought because it was right, because people you had never met needed protecting, and that was reason enough for you. That is not something I can command from anyone, no matter how absolute my authority. It is something that must be chosen freely, or it means nothing at all." She turned to face me fully then, and for the first time since I had arrived in her palace, I saw an alien queen not as a ruler weighing political calculations, but simply as someone finally willing to admit she had been wrong. "You are free to go, Daniel Hart," she said. "Your ship has been repaired and resupplied. A course has been charted back toward human space, and an escort will accompany you as far as the border to ensure your safety. You owe this empire nothing further. You never did." Relief washed through me at those words, mixed with something more complicated that I had not expected to feel, a strange reluctance that surprised me even as I recognized it. I thought of Alira, of the officers who had slowly come to trust my judgment, of the Golden City that had become, against every expectation, something close to familiar. "Thank you," I told the Queen, and I meant it fully. She studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "Though I will admit," she said, "there is a selfish hope in me that you might choose to stay a while longer, not as a prisoner, as a guest, freely welcomed for as long as you wish to remain. I found Elira later that evening in the palace gardens, sitting near the glowing plants that had fascinated me since my first night in this strange place. She looked up as I approached, and something in her expression told me she already suspected what conversation I had just finished having. "You are leaving," she said quietly. It was not quite a question. I sat down beside her, considering my answer carefully. "Eventually," I said, "but not yet. There is still work to be done here, allies to help rebuild after the attack, and honestly, I think I have earned the right to actually enjoy this place instead of just surviving it." Relief broke across her face, quick and unguarded, in a way that reminded me she was still, despite everything, remarkably young. "I am glad," she said simply. In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened at the outer colonies spread far beyond Threll space, carried along trade routes and diplomatic channels to neighboring systems, and eventually, inevitably, back toward human territory itself. The story grew with every retelling, as stories always do, but at its core, it remained simple and true. A lone human, stranded and wounded, had saved a princess, defied a queen's fear, and helped turn back an invasion that could have reshaped an entire empire. Other species began looking at humanity differently after that, I would later learn, no longer viewing us as an unpredictable curiosity at the edges of known space, but as something worth understanding, worth approaching with curiosity instead of caution. The old warnings about the unbound faded slowly from Threll historical records, replaced by newer accounts that spoke less of danger and more of an unexpected kind of strength, the kind that came not from shared minds or coordinated hives, but from individuals choosing, again and again, to do what was right, simply because it was right. I stayed on that world far longer than I ever expected to, not as a prisoner, not as a research subject, but as something the Queen had never truly offered me before that final conversation on the balcony, a choice. And in the end, that made all the difference between captivity and something that, against every possible expectation, had slowly become close to home. Eventually, I did return to human space, carrying with me stories that no one back home would ever fully believe, and a friendship with an alien princess that would shape the next chapter of my life, in ways I could not yet imagine. But that is a story for another time. For now, it was enough to know that I had walked into an empire as a stranded stranger, and walked out of it, finally, as a free man who had chosen, every single time it mattered, to stand and fight for people who were never truly his own. And somewhere far behind me, in a golden city built into the side of a mountain, a queen who had once refused to let a human go, now understood, at last, that the strongest bonds were never the ones built from fear or control. They were the ones freely given and freely returned.